London, 1865. The fog does not rise from the river anymore, it seems to fall from the sky, a slow, damp curtain that blurs lamps, faces and morality alike. You can almost hear it settling against the brickwork, carrying the faint smell of coal smoke, horse dung, and something else, something faintly sweet. Laudanum. Laudanum, the tincture of opium and alcohol, amber in colour and sold in every pharmacy and corner shop, had become the quiet companion of Victorian life. For many women, it was not indulgence but necessity, a small vial that kept the chaos of existence suspended in stillness. Pain, grief, sleeplessness, hysteria, menstruation, childbirth, mourning, all the recurring discomforts of life found one answer at the bottom of a bottle. You might imagine the London of Empire as bustling, industrious, ambitious, and you'd be right. But beneath the din of carriage wheels and the hammering of progress lay another city, a drowsy, feverish London lulled by opiates. Not the dens of the East End, heavy with smoke and legend, but the quiet parlours of middle-class homes where a mother stirred sugar into her tea with one hand and measured out 20 drops of laudanum with the other. The household cure in most homes, medicine cabinets were humble affairs, a bottle of carbolic acid for cleaning, a tin of mustard plasters, some Epsom salts, and, almost always, a bottle of laudanum. The label might read, tincture opi poison, but no one paid much attention to that. The same chemist who sold sweets to children dispensed the mixture, without prescription, to anyone with a few shillings. Laudanum was advertised for nearly every ill. In the newspapers, small printed boxes offered cure for female troubles, remedy for nervous agitations, and elixir of soothing virtue. For infants there was Godfrey's cordial, a mixture of opium and treacle. For teething babies, Mrs. Winslow's soothing syrup. For menstrual pain, Batley's sedative solution. These were not hidden poisons but public companions, as ordinary as tea. You can almost picture the scene. A woman named Mary, perhaps, standing in a narrow kitchen with light filtering through lace curtains. Her husband is at work, her children are loud, her nerves are frayed. She pours 20 drops into a glass of water, stirs and drinks. The bitterness is sharp but familiar. Within minutes the world softens. The sound of the street fades into a comforting hum. For a moment she is calm, and in that calm she finds endurance. The origins of a habit, the British fascination with opium was not born at home. Its roots stretched halfway across the world, to India, where vast poppy fields bloomed under imperial supervision. The British East India Company, that enormous hybrid of corporation and government, cultivated, taxed, and exported the drug, primarily to China. When Chinese officials protested, Britain sent gunboats. The Opium Wars of 1839 and 1856 were fought, not for freedom or sovereignty, but for the right to sell addiction. And while the Empire forced open foreign ports, the substance trickled quietly back to London, transformed into a domestic medicine. What was once a weapon of trade became a household comfort. The irony was invisible to those who swallowed it, and perhaps mercifully so. By the 1860s, Britain imported more opium than any other nation in the world. Chemists mixed it, watered it, labelled it, and sold it again. It was, in many ways, the perfect Victorian drug, respectable, inexpensive, and numbing. The women of the epidemic, men drank, women dosed. That was the unspoken rule of Victorian vice. Alcohol was coarse, public, and disreputable, but laudanum was quiet, ladylike, and easily justified. Many women began with small doses after childbirth for sleeplessness or pain. Doctors encouraged it. In a time before antibiotics, anesthesia, or psychiatric care, there were few other options. Middle-class women, constrained by strict social decorum, were especially vulnerable. They could not speak freely of depression or anxiety. They could not leave unhappy marriages. They could not admit fatigue. Instead, they soothed themselves until soothing became survival. One physician in 1870 wrote with alarm that the laudanum bottle is found more frequently in the woman's drawer than the sewing kit. But society preferred not to notice. As long as the lady of the house was calm, the home was orderly. The chemistry of calm laudanum was simple to make opium dissolved in alcohol. Its active ingredient, morphine, was first isolated in 1804, and though many believed the purified compound to be safer, it only refined the addiction. A teaspoon could contain enough opium to kill a child, but in adults, tolerance built quickly. The same 20 drops that once dulled a headache would soon do nothing at all. Physiologically, the drug slowed everything. The heart rate dropped, breathing softened, digestion slowed, time itself stretched. To a woman surrounded by endless domestic repetition, the ironing, the sweeping, the sewing, this gentle detachment might have felt like mercy, and so the epidemic spread not by rebellion but by routine. Not through vice, but through virtue. Housewives, nurses, even governesses, all maintained their composure with the same amber liquid. The doctors and the denial Victorian medicine walked a strange line between ignorance and arrogance. Doctors understood enough to prescribe opium, but not enough to recognize dependence. They called it habit, not addiction, nervous weakness, not withdrawal. A patient who stopped suddenly and grew ill was told her constitution was delicate, and was given more of the same. Pharmacies flourished. In London alone, by 1860, there were over 1,000 chemists legally selling opium-based remedies, and because there was no regulation, concentrations varied wildly. One bottle might contain twice the morphine of another, yet both would bear identical labels. In poorer districts, laudanum was cheaper than gin, and far more dignified. In richer homes, it was prescribed by doctors with embossed stationery. Addiction knew no class, though its symptoms were often disguised by it. The gentle descent, there are recorded cases, quiet and sad, of women who drifted entirely into opium's haze. Letters remain, hesitant, trembling, full of apologies. One from 1874 reads, "I am no longer myself. The days come and go, but I do not feel them. My child's laughter is distant. I mean to stop, but when I do, the world grows too loud." The tragedy was not in the scandal, but in its absence. Unlike the gin epidemics of earlier centuries, this one produced no riots, no arrests, no moral campaigns, only silence. A nation of dreamers dosing themselves to endure. Even the language of the time softened the truth. Women were described as nervous, melancholic, and valid. Their ailments were blamed on reading too much, feeling too deeply, or being confined indoors. The laudanum bottle was simply an accessory, like a handkerchief or a prayer book. Commerce and complicity behind every bottle lay profit. Pharmaceutical companies such as Allen and Hanbury's and Burroughs Wellcome grew rich on opium tinctures. Advertisements in the Times promised relief for all nervous afflictions. None mentioned dependency. Colonial trade ensured the supply never faltered. Bengal's fields were worked by farmers bound by debt, their harvests packed into chests marked with the East India Company's seal. From Calcutta to the Thames, the route of the drug was as structured and bureaucratic as any government system, and just as impersonal. Even when Parliament began to notice the rising number of accidental poisonings and deaths, little was done. After all, opium kept people docile, compliant, and quiet. It soothed the empire from within. The culture of quiet by the late 19th century, laudanum had seeped into art, literature, and memory. Writers like Thomas de Quincey and Samuel Taylor Coleridge described its visions, though few could imagine the silent multitude of women who took it not for inspiration, but for survival. The social code of the time left little room for expression. A woman was expected to be calm, composed, patient. Laudanum made that possible. It became, in its way, a chemical version of decorum, ensuring that pain never showed. Children, too, were often dosed to keep them still while mothers worked or rested. Infant deaths were sometimes quietly attributed to failure to thrive, the truth left unspoken. Pharmacists, when confronted, would shrug. "Madam, it is safe if used correctly." But correctly was a word without meaning in a world that never counted the drops too closely. A society half asleep. If you could walk the streets of Victorian London at night, past the row houses of Bloomsbury, or the narrow courts of Whitechapel, you might imagine the city alive with movement, and it was. But behind many windows the light burned low, and inside, people slept too deeply or not at all. In the quiet bedrooms of women who smiled too much and spoke too little, the opium epidemic continued unseen. By the time the first laws restricting sales appeared in the 1868 Pharmacy Act, it was already too late. Generations had learned to rely on the comfort. Addiction was a private matter, and Victorian society prized privacy above all. The end of Section 1 as the fog rolled through London, blending chimney smoke with the scent of poppy resin. The empire dreamed on, unaware that its own medicine cabinet was quietly reshaping it. From India's fields to London's parlours, a single flower connected suffering, commerce, and silence. But what happens when that silence begins to break? When the women of London, polite, restrained, and quietly dependent, start to realise what has been done to them. It began, as many things do in history, not with a protest, but with paperwork. A few London physicians, disturbed by their patients' symptoms, started to compare notes. The names on the case files were respectable. Mrs. F, age 37, neuralgia; Mrs. S, age 42, sleeplessness; Miss H, age 29, melancholy. Each had been prescribed laudanum or morphine tinctures for minor complaints. Each, over time, had become ill in ways that defied ordinary diagnosis. The women complained of faintness, trembling, nausea, and sadness. When denied their medication, they worsened. The doctors noted with growing unease that their tonics seemed to produce the very diseases they were meant to cure, but few dared to say it aloud that the empire's most trusted medicine was quietly poisoning its women. The habit no one named in polite society, there was no vocabulary for addiction. The word addict would not enter medical literature until the 1870s, and even then it was rarely applied to women. To be addicted implied moral weakness, impropriety, and Victorian women, by social design, could be neither. Instead, doctors called them nervous invalids, their illness constitutional or hysterical. In truth, hysteria itself was often a symptom of withdrawal. When the laudanum bottle was empty or withheld, patients suffered convulsions, sweating, uncontrollable weeping, and violent agitation. Physicians prescribed more of the same to calm them, creating a perfect endless circle, a genteel dependency. It was not unusual for a household to order several bottles a week. Chemists delivered them alongside groceries, their invoices discreetly folded into ledgers. A husband might never realize that his wife's sleeping draught contained opium. A doctor might not suspect that his own patient was also being treated by two others across the city. The middle-class epidemic by the 1870s. England's medical journals began quietly to acknowledge the scale of the issue. Dr. Thomas Clifford Albert, a Cambridge physician, wrote in 1870 that, among our middle-class women, the laudanum habit has spread like the influenza, yet without the public alarm that such a contagion should provoke. He described patients who dosed themselves every morning to face the tedium of domestic life, and every night to calm the unnameable disquiet of the mind. This was not the public vice of gin, no loud taverns, no drunken disorder. This was an epidemic of silence, a disease hidden behind closed curtains and polite manners. For many women, the drug had become a companion. Some kept the bottle in their sewing basket, others carried a small vial in a handbag or desk drawer. They wrote in diaries, letters that still survive, of the comfort it brought, even as it consumed them. I know I am not well, one woman wrote in 1871, but when I am without it I cannot think. It steadies me, it makes me patient, the house is so quiet when I have it. The chemist's empire in London alone, over 200 registered chemists sold opium freely by the 1870s. Most mixed their own tinctures from imported Bengal opium, diluted in alcohol and flavored with cinnamon or anise to disguise the bitterness. Profit margins were immense. 1 gallon of tincture could yield dozens of small bottles sold at 6p each. The trade was unregulated, respectable, and lucrative. Many chemists justified their business as a public service. As one wrote in a letter to the Lancet, "Better the chemist bottle than the public house. I sell peace, not riot." But beneath this moral veneer lay the same exploitative machinery that drove empire itself. The farmers in India who cultivated poppies for the East India Company did so under debt and coercion. Their harvests were auctioned in Calcutta, shipped to Britain, and distilled into domestic dependence. It was a global chain of quiet suffering, from field to pharmacy to parlor. The doctors began to notice, while some physicians ignored the problem. Others began to document it with precision. In 1874, Dr. Oscar Jennings published a small but influential pamphlet titled On the Morphia Habit and Its Treatment. He described how women, particularly those of refined and sedentary habits, developed dependency after long medical treatment. Jennings was careful not to condemn them. He noted that the constraints of propriety render women unable to confess their suffering, and thus they turn to the bottle rather than the doctor. His empathy was rare and quietly radical. Still, reform was slow. The medical profession, dominated by men, was reluctant to acknowledge that its own prescriptions had caused the crisis. And so, rather than restrict access, they often shifted blame to women's nerves, their temperament, their supposed fragility. The opium epidemic became another justification for patriarchy proof. They said that women could not be trusted with their own bodies. Withdrawal and secrecy dependence on laudanum was not violent or spectacular. It crept quietly, like ivy, through the routines of daily life. When deprived, the body rebelled, tremors, sweats, insomnia, aching limbs. But these symptoms were rarely recognized for what they were. A woman in withdrawal might be told she suffered female weakness or moral exhaustion. Her doctor would prescribe more laudanum. The result was a cycle with no clear beginning or end, and for many, shame kept the truth buried. Confession meant scandal, better to endure in silence. A small number of women did try to stop. They left written accounts of their struggles, dry, factual, painfully restrained. One anonymous letter published in the British Medical Journal in 1878 described it in precise detail. I have been for 5 years under the influence of this drug. When I withhold it, I am seized with pains as of great cold, and my heart trembles. I cannot rest nor read nor sue. I weep without cause. My children fear me. I resume the drops, and all is still again. The tone was not of self-pity, but of resignation. These were not rebels, but survivors of their own prescriptions. The 1868 Pharmacy Act Parliament, slow to act and even slower to understand, finally responded to growing public concern with the Pharmacy Act of 1868, Britain's first attempt to regulate opium. The law required that opium and its derivatives be sold only by registered chemists, and that bottles carry the warning label, poison. But there were no restrictions on quantity, and no requirement for prescriptions. The act was more symbolic than practical, a gesture of control without enforcement. Sales continued, profits rose, and the epidemic deepened. The label poison became just another part of the packaging, no more alarming than best before. In some ways, the new regulation even lent legitimacy to the product. If Parliament had labelled it, surely it must be safe. Literary echoes, the drug's influence, seeped into Victorian literature, reflecting and reinforcing its ubiquity. Writers such as Wilkie Collins, who himself suffered from rheumatic pain and used laudanum daily, wove opium into their narratives. In The Moonstone, 1868, the protagonist's dose of laudanum becomes the hinge of the entire mystery. In poetry, Coleridge's opium dreams had already blurred the line between imagination and intoxication. Even Dickens hinted at it in his darker works, where despair and dependence walked hand in hand through London's alleys. These portrayals were not condemnations, they were acknowledgements of a shared secret. The readers who followed these stories often did so with a laudanum bottle by their bedside. The silent revolution of reformers, not everyone accepted the epidemic as inevitable. By the late 1870s, a small but determined group of reformers, many of them women, began to speak out. Writers like Frances Power Cobbe, an early feminist and social activist, linked women's opium use to the constraints of their domestic lives. She argued that society, by denying women freedom, forces them to seek false comfort in chemical submission. Temperance groups, originally focused on alcohol, soon expanded their campaigns to include opium. Pamphlets circulated, warning of the mother's bottle of death and the infant's cordial of silence. Some reformers visited chemists personally, pleading for restrictions. Others lobbied Parliament. Their voices were few and often dismissed as hysterical or moralizing. But they planted the first seeds of awareness that would, decades later, grow into modern drug legislation. The medicalization of dependence. By the 1880s, doctors began to recognize laudanum dependence as a distinct medical condition. Hospitals opened small wards for nervous disorders, where patients, often women, were admitted for rest cures and gradual withdrawal. Treatments varied wildly. Some physicians substituted milder sedatives like bromides or chloral hydrate. Others prescribed morphine injections, unaware that they were replacing one addiction with another. One notable case from St. Thomas Hospital described a woman who, after a decade of laudanum use, was treated by confinement, fresh air, and nutritional milk. The report concluded, rather optimistically, that she was all much improved, though of fragile constitution. Whether she truly recovered is unknown, but the shift was significant. For the first time, doctors acknowledged that dependence was not moral weakness, it was illness. The broader picture, the opium epidemic among women, was only one thread in a much larger fabric. Across the empire, opium was both medicine and weapon. In India, it enslaved farmers. In China, it destroyed dynasties. In London, it pacified the restless middle class. The same substance, the same empire, the same delusion, that control could be maintained through comfort. For women in Victorian England, the drug offered a kind of invisible freedom. It dulled the edges of a constrained life, allowing endurance where rebellion was impossible. But at what cost? When pain is erased, so too is the sense of self that pain defines. The first cracks in the silence. By the end of the century, a few voices, doctors, reformers, journalists, began to say what no one had dared, that the epidemic was not a private affliction but a public failure, that women had been medicated into submission by a society that refused to hear them. In 1891, the British Medical Journal published a stern editorial titled The Laudanum Habit Among Women of England. It called for national data collection, pharmacy inspections, and stricter control. The language was clinical, but the message clear: the epidemic was not only real, it was English, domestic, and shamefully ignored. Still, change came slowly. Even as the new century approached, bottles of laudanum continued to clink in cupboards across the country, their amber glow reflected in gaslight. End of section 2. And so, By the late Victorian era, London was beginning to stir from its chemical sleep. Doctors whispered of dependence, reformers wrote pamphlets, Parliament debated. But the epidemic, like fog, lingered in the alleys and drawing rooms alike. What then would finally bring it to an end? Would it be law, medicine, or morality, or something else entirely? What happens when an empire built on opium finally tries to wake itself? It is easy to imagine that epidemics end with noise, riots, decrees, revolutions. But the laudanum epidemic did not end that way. It faded gradually like a long sigh. By the turn of the 20th century, the same fog that once hid London's dependence began to lift, and with it came a clearer view of what the 19th century had left behind. In 1901, the census listed nearly 40,000 chemists across Britain, but by then, the bottles they sold were changing. Labels bore stricter warnings, ingredients were diluted, morphine content reduced. The public was awakening not with outrage, but with a kind of wary understanding, a recognition that what had been medicine was, in truth, control. The first true restrictions, the first genuine blow to the open sale of opium came not from moral crusaders but from bureaucracy. The Pharmacy Act of 1868 had been too gentle to matter, but later reforms added precision. The Poisons and Pharmacy Act of 1908 imposed clearer definitions, separating narcotics from ordinary remedies. Chemists were now required to keep detailed records of every sale: name, quantity, purpose. By 1912, the International Opium Convention had brought Britain, reluctantly, into an international agreement to restrict the global trade it had once dominated. The irony was not lost on observers. The same empire that had fought 2 wars to preserve the opium trade now signed treaties to restrain it. Yet even as foreign shipments slowed, the domestic legacy endured. The women of the laudanum age, those who had raised children, buried husbands, survived wars and pregnancies and sleeplessness with a bottle in hand, were growing old. Some were too dependent to stop. Others had already stopped quietly without telling anyone. The epidemic did not collapse, it simply aged out. The new science of the mind at the same time. Medicine itself was transforming. The rise of modern psychiatry gave new names to old sufferings: depression, anxiety, trauma. What had once been hysteria began to be studied rather than scorned. But while this shift promised understanding, it also brought a new kind of control. Doctors who once handed out laudanum now prescribed chloral hydrate, barbiturates, and later veronal. Each was hailed as safer, modern, scientific, and each would in time become its own quiet crisis. Addiction did not vanish, it merely changed its bottle. Yet for the women of the late Victorian and Edwardian periods, there was at last the faint recognition that their suffering was not moral failure. A doctor might, for the first time, say aloud what earlier generations could not: "You are not weak, you are unwell." That simple distinction, though late in coming, marked a new era of compassion. The cultural memory of opium Victorian literature had long romanticized the dreamlike haze of opium. But as the 20th century progressed, the tone shifted. Writers like Thomas Hardy and George Gissing treated it not as inspiration, but as escape, a symbol of England's wary soul. By 1920, when the Dangerous Drugs Act placed morphine, heroin, and cocaine under strict control, the cultural fascination had curdled into caution. The opium den, once exoticized in penny novels and illustrated papers, now appeared as a relic of a darker time, a warning, not a wonder. But the domestic, feminine side of the epidemic, the vials beside teacups, the drops in bedtime milk, was quietly forgotten. The official narrative of addiction focused on sailors, criminals, and the poor. The women who had lived and died under laudanum's influence slipped out of history's frame, and yet their presence lingered in quieter forms, in diaries, medical records, recipes written in delicate cursive on yellowing paper. Between the lines, one can read fatigue, courage, and something close to resignation. The economics of forgetting empires are skilled at erasing the uncomfortable parts of their own machinery. Britain, by the early 1900s, was happy to denounce opium as a foreign problem. Newspapers described it as an oriental curse, something that came from over there. Few remembered that the poppy fields of Bengal had once been English property, that the prophets had built hospitals, universities, and railways. The story of opium's domestic impact on London's women, on its working poor, was simply not convenient. Official histories focused on trade policy, treaties, and wars. The human side, the mothers who drifted into chemical sleep to endure an unendurable world, was quietly omitted. Even reformers, once their goals were achieved, moved on to other causes. By the 1920s, the memory of the epidemic had softened into anecdote, the kind told by an elderly aunt about that old remedy we used to take for nerves. The empire had forgiven itself. The silent survivors, some women, however, left traces of their awakening. Letters written late in life, often by those who had managed to stop, reveal a mixture of shame and clarity. One from 1911 reads, "When I ceased to take it, I learned how large the world is. The light seemed to return to the room, but I was a stranger to my own thoughts. I think now that I lived half my life in a dream, and it was not altogether unpleasant." Another, written in 1903 by a widow from Bath, described the experience of withdrawal in meticulous, almost scientific terms. "For some months, my hands would tremble when I reached for my teacup, expecting its comfort. But each week the shaking lessened, and by spring I found that I could read again without the drifting of the mind. I had not realized how heavy the air had been until it cleared." Such accounts are rare, not because the experiences were few, but because they were private. In the quiet dignity of Victorian domestic life, suffering was never spectacle. Even recovery was whispered. The legacy of control in hindsight, historians see the laudanum epidemic not merely as a tragedy of chemistry, but as a mirror of social control. Opium soothed the empire's laborers, comforted its mothers, and silenced its dissenters. It kept order not through law or violence, but through sedation. Women, in particular, bore the burden of that order, denied agency in nearly every sphere, economic, political, emotional. They found in the opium bottle a paradoxical freedom, relief from pain, but also from awareness. The drug was both liberation and leash. The modern world, though proud of its progress, still echoes that pattern. The substances have changed, the prescriptions renamed, but the dynamic remains familiar: chemical calm sold as convenience, marketed as care. The laudanum epidemic was not the end of a story, but its first chapter. The empire wakes. By 1925, Britain had fully committed to international opium control. The poppy fields of India were reduced, the trade to China curtailed. Medical use of opium and morphine was confined to hospitals, where it was locked away and documented with bureaucratic precision. In London, chemists now displayed bottles of aspirin, quinine, and phenacetin, safer, modern alternatives. Laudanum, once a fixture of every home, became a curiosity, its bitter scent fading into memory. A new generation grew up without it. For them, the stories of the drops sounded quaint, almost folkloric, like tales of bleeding with leeches or curing coughs with mercury. But the old women who remembered did not laugh. They knew how softly the line between medicine and dependence could blur. A change of light. If you walk today through the streets of Bloomsbury or Clerkenwell, where many of these stories unfolded, you can still find the faded lettering of old chemists' shops on the brick Farsadis Apothecary, established 1842, purveyor of medicinal remedies. The interiors are gone, replaced by cafes and boutiques, but the ghosts remain. Imagine for a moment those shelves lined with glass bottles, each amber vessel filled with promise and danger. Imagine the faint clink of a dropper against glass, the rustle of skirts, the sigh of relief that followed. The sound was ordinary, unremarkable, yet behind it lay a world shaped by quiet desperation. History rarely records the moments when people simply endured. But endurance, more than conquest, defines an age. Reflection, the quiet resistance in the end. The story of the Victorian opium epidemic is not one of villains and victims, but of survival. Women used what they had in a world that gave them little. They found a way to remain calm, composed, capable, even when crushed by expectation. They did not seek escape so much as stillness, a pause in a life of endless duty. And perhaps that is why the story feels both distant and familiar. Because even now, the same yearning persists to quiet the noise, to soften the edges, to find peace in a restless world. The poppy fields of Bengal have long been harvested, the glass bottles emptied, the empire gone. But the lesson remains that the line between comfort and control is thinner than it seems, and history, like the drug itself, has a way of numbing the pain it causes. As the final London fog of that century lifted, a faint light returned to the windows. The women who survived it watched it with wary clarity. The city was the same, yet somehow new, awake, but quieter than before. And somewhere, perhaps in an attic drawer or forgotten medicine cabinet, one last bottle of laudanum lay unopened, a relic of an age that tried to sleep its sorrows away. The air along Bristol's harbour in 1784 carried a scent that was equal parts salt timber and fermented leaves. Tea, green, black, oolong, packed tight into chests of pale Chinese wood, bound with brass nails and sealed in lead paper. The chests arrived by the hundreds, stacked in pyramids on the docks, each marked with careful brushstrokes in Chinese script and British numbers. To most Londoners, tea was a matter of taste and ritual. To the dock workers of Bristol, it was simply weight, heavy, fragrant and endless. When you imagine the tea trade of the 18th century, you might picture aristocrats in fine parlors, porcelain cups steaming delicately beside lace gloves. But every sip began here in the mud and noise of the Avon docks, where men worked 12-hour shifts loading and unloading the empire's thirst. And though they lived among the treasures of global commerce, the dockworkers themselves were barely visible, anonymous laborers who moved the wealth of nations for pennies a day. A city at the edge of empire, by the late 18th century, Bristol was still recovering from its loss of primacy to Liverpool. Once Britain's leading slave trading port, it had been outpaced by faster harbours and newer ships, but its docks still thrummed with activity. Tobacco, sugar, rum, and now, increasingly, tea, arrived from London-bound ships that paused in Bristol for warehousing and refitting. The tea itself was precious. The tax on tea, introduced in 1721 and raised several times thereafter, made it one of the most valuable commodities per pound in Britain. Smuggling was rampant. Legal imports, tightly controlled by the East India Company, were protected like gold. A chest of tea worth a few pounds at the dock could retail for 20 times that in the city. A single misplaced crate was enough to ruin a merchant. And so, while the dockworkers sweated through the nights, overseers watched every movement with suspicion. Each man's pocket could be searched, each bundle counted twice. The workers called the tea the leaves of the lords. The rhythm of the docks, if you stood on the quiet dawn, you would see a rhythm as steady as the tide itself. Men arrived in groups, rope makers, carpenters, hauliers, lightermen, their tools slung over shoulders. The first cranes began to creak by sunrise. Horses snorted in the chill. Steam curled from the mouths of men and animals alike. They worked in teams, often in silence. The labor was back-breaking and repetitive lifting, stacking, rolling barrels, shifting crates. A single cargo ship might carry 600 chests of tea, each weighing more than 60 pounds. The smell of tea mingled with that of tar, sweat, and brine. To those who handled it daily, the scent became part of their bodies. Some said they could taste it on their skin. For many, it was their only connection to the empire they served. They knew nothing of the Chinese hills where the leaves were grown, nor the Indian plantations that would soon replace them. They only knew the weight, literal and symbolic, of what Britain demanded. The men who moved the empire, the dockworkers of Bristol, were not a single class, but a spectrum of survival. At the top were the stevedores, skilled labourers responsible for loading and balancing ships' cargoes. Below them were lumpers and dock porters, hired by the day, often through middlemen. Work was irregular. A storm in the channel or a delay in customs could leave hundreds unemployed for weeks. Many slept near the docks in boarding houses or sheds, their wages gone as quickly as they earned them. Few could read or write. But they knew the tides, the sounds of ropes and wood, the subtle creaks that warned when a load was shifting dangerously. They could gauge the weight of a tea chest by its sound when dropped from a height. They knew which crates had been opened, which were damp, which were stolen and resealed. In an empire obsessed with order, these men lived in a world of improvisation. The tea tax and the shadow economy. The tea tax was never merely about revenue. It was about control. In Britain, every pound of imported tea was taxed at rates so high that the smuggling trade exploded. Entire coastal villages in Cornwall and Devon survived by running contraband tea inland under cover of darkness. Bristol, though less notorious than the south coast, played its part. Dockworkers, underpaid and overworked, learned the art of pilfering. A few leaves scraped from a broken crate here, a small packet hidden in a sleeve there. It was easy to justify. Just dust, they'd say, referring to the leftover fragments swept from the dock floor. Over time, networks emerged. Tea dust became barter, then trade, then smuggling. Women in nearby St. Philip's district sold small paper packets in markets, their profits barely enough to feed a family. The same leaves that graced the cups of aristocrats in Bath and London had likely passed through a dockworker's calloused hands first. Yet when Parliament debated the tea tax, these workers' lives were never mentioned. The discussions centred on revenue, commerce, and colonial policy, not on the men who carried the empire's cargo or the families who survived on its crumbs. The dockside women, for every man unloading ships, there was often a woman waiting nearby. Dockside wives, widows, and mothers gathered in the alleys behind the quay, hauling laundry, mending ropes, selling food. They were part of the same system, unpaid or underpaid labor that made empire possible. Some worked as tea leaf pickers, sorting through sweepings of broken leaves collected from warehouse floors, reselling them to local grocers. Others blended oozed tea with new, dried leaves, a common, if unsanitary, practice. Adulteration was so rampant that in 1820 Parliament would pass the first Food Adulteration Act largely because of tea. For these women, survival required cunning. They lived on the margins of legality, much like the men they loved. Their hands, too, smelled faintly of tea, though few could afford to drink it. The quiet politics of labour in the 1790s. Bristol's docks became a microcosm of empire's contradictions. Wealth flowed through them, but not to them. When dock workers demanded higher pay, merchants dismissed them as ungrateful. The work is simple, they said, any man can do it. But this was untrue. The balancing of cargo, the coordination of cranes and ropes, required judgment and experience. Still, no one thought to call them workers of the empire. That phrase was reserved for soldiers, traders, and explorers, not the men who hauled tea, sugar, and tobacco through English rain. Strikes were rare and dangerous. To refuse work was to risk starvation. A man could be blacklisted for a single outburst. His name passed quietly from one foreman to another. So instead of rebellion, they endured. A more powerful kind of resistance, if a quieter one. The taste of wealth while dock workers lived in rented rooms. The merchants of Bristol dined in Georgian townhouses with imported china, silver spoons, and exotic teas. To them, tea was not just drink but identity, refinement distilled into ritual. A merchant's wife might boast of her husband's latest import from Canton, even as she sipped from leaves handled by men who could not afford bread. The irony was invisible to those above. Empire had made class invisible by design. The labourers and the lords both depended on the same cargo, yet lived in different worlds, one of ceremony, the other of survival. And perhaps the most striking thing was this: both found comfort in tea. For the wealthy it was civility, for the poor it was warmth. One drank to display refinement, the other to feel alive. When the tide changed by the 1830s, new technology began to alter everything. Steam engines replaced sails, iron ships replaced wood, and the pace of commerce accelerated. Bristol, once vital, began to decline as Liverpool and London expanded their modern docks. For the dock workers, this meant instability. Old crews were laid off, new machinery reduced the need for muscle, the familiar rhythm of the port, the creak of ropes, the slap of waves, the grunt of men, was gradually replaced by the hiss of steam and the clatter of gears. But before that change fully arrived, there was a period of strange abundance. After the Commutation Act of 1784, which drastically reduced the tea tax to curb smuggling, legal imports soared. Suddenly, tea was everywhere, affordable even to the working class. The dockers' hands still carried it, but now, for the first time, they might also drink it. For a brief moment, the product that had enslaved their labour became their comfort. The paradox of the leaves. There is something deeply English about finding solace in the very thing that symbolizes your subjugation. Tea, once the currency of empire, became its anesthetic. The dock workers drank it at dawn, mixing it with cheap sugar and condensed milk, finding warmth before another long shift. It was bitter still, but no longer forbidden, and perhaps that small act of ownership, that reclaiming of taste, was a kind of victory. A quiet rebellion brewed in a mug. The end of Section 1. So the harbour slept and woke with the tides, its people bound by the rhythm of cargo and coin. For every chest of tea that crossed those planks, there were stories unseen, of hands that lifted, backs that bent, and mouths that tasted only what was left behind. But soon, that quiet world would begin to change. New machines, new laws, and new ideas about labour were about to arrive. And when they did, the forgotten dock workers of Bristol, men who had endured for generations, would face a different kind of reckoning. The industrial age crept into Bristol not with thunder, but with smoke. The first steam cranes were installed in 1834, brought from London at great expense. They were ungainly mechanical beasts, iron arms powered by the same coal that blackened the sky. The dock workers gathered around to watch as the first was tested, its great wheel turning slowly, hissing, sighing, exhaling like a living creature. Some men clapped, others spat. One older lumper muttered, "That's the end of us, that is." He wasn't wrong. The shifting world of work, the steam crane could lift more cargo in a day than 20 men with ropes and pulleys. It did not tire, it did not eat, and it did not ask for wages. For the merchants, it was a marvel of progress. For the dock workers, it was the start of a quiet extinction. In the years that followed, the docks grew more efficient and more ruthless. The men who once laboured by muscle alone found themselves competing with machines. Wages dropped. The hiring system, already precarious, became brutal. Each morning, hundreds of men would gather at the quay gates before sunrise. Foremen walked among them, selecting crews for the day. The unlucky ones, often most of them, were turned away. The men called it the stand, and it became a daily ritual of desperation. One worker later described it in a letter to a parish priest. You stand and wait as if you are cattle. They look at your hands, your back, your face, and they pick who seems strongest. If you cough, they walk past you. If you limp, you starve. This was the new empire, steam-powered and indifferent. The forgotten middleman between the merchants and the dock workers stood a class that history barely remembers. The contractors. They were men of small ambition but immense control, hired to supply labor to the docks on short notice. They kept lists of names, charged fees for placement, and often took a cut of every worker's pay. To get a job, a man might have to buy the contractor a drink or promise to vote for a particular candidate. It was a system of patronage disguised as employment. For decades, it kept the dock workers divided. No union could take root, because no man could risk being seen as troublesome. The contractors would simply stop calling his name in the morning. The power of the few, it seemed, rested on the silence of the many. The taste of empire, meanwhile, the demand for tea only grew. By the 1840s, the average Briton drank 6 pounds of tea per year, more than any other people in the world. Tea had become the quiet heartbeat of the empire, flowing inward from India and China, outward again through the cups of every class. But the nature of that trade was changing. The East India Company, once the empire's proud monopoly, was unraveling under pressure from reformers and smugglers alike. After the Charter Act of 1833, the company's trade monopoly ended, opening the market to private merchants. For Bristol, this meant opportunity. Independent traders could now import tea directly from Canton or Calcutta, bypassing London. Small firms sprang up along the Avon, renting warehouses and hiring crews by the day. It should have been a revival. But for the dockworkers, it only meant more uncertainty. The work grew more seasonal, the pay more erratic. A single failed shipment or a wet summer could wipe out a firm, and with it, the livelihoods of dozens of men. The empire was growing, but its foundations were still mud and sweat, women and the tea blenders. While the men fought for daily wages, a quieter transformation was taking place in the warehouses above the docks. There, women, often the wives and daughters of dock workers, were employed as tea blenders. It was delicate work, requiring a nose for subtlety and an eye for consistency. They mixed Chinese black teas with Indian Assam, Ceylon with Darjeeling, creating the flavors that would come to define Victorian Britain. The work was done by hand without gloves, in dim rooms that smelled of earth and perfume. A woman might handle hundreds of pounds of tea in a day, her fingers stained brown, her lungs filled with dust. There were no masks, no protections, yet few complained. Compared to laundry or domestic service, it was clean, indoor work, and it paid a few shillings more. By night, those same women returned home to the same small rooms, often sharing lodging with other families. The scent of tea followed them everywhere, clinging to hair and skin. One blending girl wrote in a local pamphlet, "You cannot smell the air after a day of work. You breathe only leaves. It gets into your dreams." The silent smugglers, even after the tax reduction and the decline of the East India Company, smuggling persisted. Old habits die hard, and so did hunger. In the alleys near Prince's Wharf, entire families worked as tea cutters, unsealing crates, dividing leaves into smaller bags, and reselling them to taverns or travellers. Some were honest merchants, others were thieves. The local constables knew the trade but turned a blind eye, especially when bribed with a few ounces of tea. The line between legal and illegal commerce was as blurred as the tea dust in the air. A dock worker might haul the same chest twice in his life, once for a merchant, once for a smuggler, and never know the difference. Machines and men. By the 1850s, the full industrialization of the docks was underway. Rail lines now ran directly to the harbour, carrying goods inland faster than ever before. Warehouses expanded upward, their windows filled with the silhouettes of steam-powered hoists. It was progress, yes, but progress with casualties. Hundreds of dock workers were laid off as cranes and conveyor systems replaced their muscle. Those who remained worked longer hours for less pay. A man might now oversee a machine instead of hauling a crate, but he was still expendable. Accidents were frequent. Steam engines exploded, ropes snapped, cargo fell. There were no safety laws, no compensation. A man who lost his hand or his leg was simply replaced. The newspapers rarely mentioned their names. A line in the Bristol Mercury might read, "A dock porter was killed by a falling load of tea chests on Tuesday last." And that was all. No name, no family, no story. The dockers' awakening change, however, was coming. In 1871, the Trade Union Act legalized unions in Britain for the first time. It was a quiet but revolutionary shift. Across the nation, workers began to organize not violently, but methodically. In Bristol, the idea spread slowly. The dock workers had long been scattered, divided by contractors and fear. But a small group began to meet in a public house near the floating harbour, sharing grievances over mugs of cheap oil. They called themselves the Men of the Tide. Their first demand was simple, steady pay for steady work. Their second was daring recognition. It took years, but by the 1880s, the dock workers' unions had grown strong enough to strike. In 1889, inspired by the London dock strike, Bristol's labourers joined in solidarity. For the first time in their history, the forgotten men of the tea trade refused to move a single crate. The city trembled. Merchants protested, newspapers raged. But the docks went silent, and that silence spoke louder than any sermon. After a week, the employers yielded. The men won a modest pay increase, and more importantly, dignity. For the first time, they were no longer invisible. The decline of a port, yet even as they celebrated, the world was shifting again. By the turn of the 20th century, global trade routes had changed. Bigger ships favoured deeper ports like Liverpool and Southampton. Bristol, with its winding Avon and shallow harbour, fell behind. The warehouses grew quiet. The blending rooms closed. The smell of tea faded from the air, replaced by the scent of coal and oil. Some of the old dock workers' sons joined the merchant navy. Others found work in factories inland. The age of the dockside tea carrier was ending. But the habits they had helped shape, the morning cup, the working class ritual of tea breaks, the comfort of the brew after labour, those endured. The culture of tea had left the docks, but the docks had left their mark on the culture of tea. Empire's ghost in a teacup. By the early 1900s, the British Empire was at its zenith. Its ships ruled the seas, its goods circled the globe, and its symbol, ironically, was the same drink once smuggled through Bristol's alleys. Yet few paused to think of the hands that had carried it, or the lungs that had filled with its dust. History, like commerce, forgets its carriers. The dock workers had never written memoirs, never appeared in portraits, never been invited to the banquets where tea was served. Their legacy existed only in the invisible. Rituals, customs, habits of rest. Every time a factory whistle blew for tea break, every time a worker poured a cup at dawn before heading to the yard, their ghost was present. They had built the empire's quietest comfort, and then faded into it. The end of Section 2. As the 20th century approached, the dock stood between worlds. Half industrial, half forgotten. Tea still arrived, but the names on the crates had changed. India had replaced China. Machines had replaced men. The empire that once thrived on human backs now ran on steam and steel. But the questions remained. What becomes of a city when its workers are no longer needed? And what becomes of men when progress forgets their names? When dawn broke over the Bristol docks in 1901, the air was no longer thick with the chatter of men or the groan of ropes. The harbour that had once carried half the empire's luxuries now sat in uneasy quiet. Steam cranes stood idle. Warehouses that once smelled of spice, sugar, and tea now reeked faintly of rust. The last generation of dock workers, the men who had seen both the rise of industry and its automation, were aging, their hands no longer calloused but stiff with arthritis. Some gathered each morning not to work, but simply to watch the ships that still came. They stood leaning against railings, hats low, pipes unlit, staring at cargo they no longer carried. Their city had outgrown them, the empire at its peak, and the men beneath it. Britain's empire at the start of the 20th century was vast, nearly a quarter of the planet's land and people. Tea from India, cotton from Egypt, spices from Ceylon, rubber from Malaya, all flowed through ports like Bristol. But as global trade modernized, the hierarchy hardened. The empire ran on invisible labor: coolies in Assam, plantation workers in Ceylon, sailors in Calcutta, and dockhands in Britain's own coastal towns. The network was global, but its human cost was always local. And Bristol, once a proud mercantile hub, had become a provincial stopover, useful, but no longer vital. The new tea warehouses in London's East India docks handled millions of pounds of imports per month, far beyond what Bristol could manage. Railways bypassed the Avon entirely, favouring faster routes to inland cities. Progress, as always, was a polite word for replacement. The tea rooms and the factory bell. While the docks slowed, the rest of the city transformed. Factories rose in St. Philip's and Bedminster, drawing workers from the waterfront. The same men who once balanced cargo on their backs now stood beside conveyor belts, tending to machines that never tired. Inside those factories, a new ritual emerged: the tea break. It was brief, often no more than 10 minutes, but sacred. The whistle would blow, tools were set down, and the workers gathered near the windows or the yard, each with a chipped mug in hand. milk, sugar, sometimes a biscuit. They drank quickly, quietly, gratefully. It was a small act of rest, a pause inherited from generations who had labored on the docks. Where once they had carried the tea, they now consumed it, reclaiming it as their own. That moment of warmth in a cold industrial day was the dock workers' legacy, distilled to its simplest form: pause, breathe, endure. The disappearing docks by the 1930s, Bristol's floating harbour had become obsolete. The ships had grown too large, their hulls too deep. The Avonmouth and Portishead docks, built closer to the sea, took over most of the trade. The old port decayed in slow motion, cranes rusted, ropes rotted, and entire warehouses were left to dust. Grass grew through cobblestones that had once been worn smooth by 1,000 boots. A few buildings were repurposed for small workshops or storage, but most stood empty. The river still flowed, indifferent to what had changed around it. The silence was not total, though. Children played where ships had once docked, their laughter echoing against the stone walls. Old men sat on barrels, telling stories of when the world's wealth had passed through their hands. They spoke of the smell of tea, how it clung to the air for days after a cargo was unloaded. They spoke of the feel of rope, of coluses so deep they no longer felt pain. They spoke, most of all, of pride. Even forgotten labour remembers itself. The war and the return of labour. When the Second World War reached Britain, Bristol's docks found new life, not as a commercial port, but as a supply hub for the military. Tea, once a luxury, became a necessity. It was shipped by the ton to the front lines, to India, North Africa, France. Soldiers drank it before battles, after marches, in trenches and tents. It was morale in liquid form. And so, once again, the old men of the docks were called upon. Younger dockers had gone to war, leaving gaps that needed filling. The retired and the near-retired returned, their bodies slow but their experience irreplaceable. They worked not for merchants this time, but for survival itself. And when the war ended, many stayed on until their health failed them. They had come full circle, carrying tea for empire once more, but now for endurance, not profit. The post-war years, and after 1945, Britain changed more in a decade than it had in a century. The empire began to crumble. India declared independence in 1947, followed by a wave of decolonization across Asia and Africa. The tea that once symbolized British power was now imported from independent nations, its price set not by imperial monopoly but by global market forces. In Bristol, the docks tried to modernize. New cranes were built and the Avonmouth terminal expanded, but it was too late. By the 1960s, containerization had revolutionized shipping. Cargo was now sealed in massive metal boxes that could be lifted by automated cranes. No more ropes, no more barrels, no more dock workers lining up at dawn. A single machine could do in an hour what 100 men once did in a day. The remaining workers were laid off in waves. Some were offered training in new trades. Others simply vanished into the city's growing industrial suburbs. And so ended the world of the tea porters, the men who had lifted an empire without ever being invited to taste it. The tea dust of memory. By the 1980s, the old docks had become a quiet ruin. Artists, students, and developers began to move in, converting warehouses into galleries and flats. Tourists came to see the historic harbour, unaware that what they walked on was once a working man's world of grime and exhaustion. The scent of tea had long gone, replaced by the smell of espresso and diesel buses, but the ghosts lingered. In the creak of old beams, the faint marks of hoist chains on brick, the uneven stones where men had stood waiting for work. One of the last surviving dockers, interviewed in 1986, said simply, "We didn't know we were history. We just knew we were tired." And perhaps that is the truest line ever spoken about the labouring class. Those who carried the empire unnoticed into its golden age and its dusk alike. The global reflection today, as you drink your tea, perhaps without thinking, you are connected, however faintly, to that forgotten chain. The leaves in your cup may come from India, Kenya, or Sri Lanka, but their journey still mirrors those of old, planted, picked, packed, shipped, carried, poured. Each link in that chain bears the weight of unseen labour, and the quiet endurance of those Bristol men lives on, not in monuments but in rituals. The same tea break that interrupts the day, the same warmth that softens hardship. Tea, the empire's softest export, became the working class's gentlest inheritance. The harbour that slept, walk along Bristol's harbour today, and you'll see the water still, the old warehouses converted into restaurants, their wooden beams polished but unchanged. If you close your eyes, you might still hear the echoes, the rhythmic thud of boots, the creak of cranes, the hiss of steam. You might even catch a trace of something else, the faint, almost forgotten smell of tea, seeping from the past like a whisper. The harbour in its long sleep remembers. And perhaps that's all history really is, a harbour of memory, tides of labour washing in and out, leaving traces on the shore. Imagine a glass box, delicate, rectangular, sealed tight against the world. Inside it, a small fern rests on damp soil, its fronds curling toward the condensation that forms each morning against the pane. The air inside never escapes, the moisture cycles endlessly, evaporating, condensing, falling back to the roots. To you it might look like a simple terrarium. To the Victorians it was a miracle. This was the Wardian case, invented by Dr. Nathaniel Bagshaw Ward in the 1820s, a contraption that would quietly transform the movement of plants across the British Empire. It would change what people drank, what they wore, and how entire colonies lived. But behind the invention, and behind the glorious palm houses of Kew Gardens, were hundreds of men and women who lived and died tending the Empire's plants. They worked in heat and rot, in silence, surrounded by beauty that was not their own. This is their story. The invention of contained life. Nathaniel Ward was not a gardener. He was a doctor, a physician in London's East End, treating the poor in the smog-choked streets of Whitechapel. His fascination with plants began almost accidentally. One evening, sometime in 1829, Ward placed a chrysalis inside a sealed glass bottle, hoping to watch a moth emerge. Weeks later he discovered not just an insect, but also a small fern and blade of grass growing inside, thriving without any attention. He realized something profound. If plants could live sealed off from the world, they could be transported anywhere. In an age when sea voyages killed almost every living specimen, salt spray, heat rot, and drought turning green treasures to mush, Ward's discovery was revolutionary. By sealing soil and plants inside glass and soldered metal, ships could now carry ferns from London to Calcutta, tea plants from China to India, and rubber trees from Brazil to Ceylon. The Empire's gardens would soon be global, but in the quiet corners of Kew Gardens, someone had to grow and maintain these living specimens before and after their journeys. That task fell to the gardeners, ordinary men and women who worked under glass, where the heat never broke and the air smelled always of moss and iron. Inside the Glashhouses. Walk with me through Kew Gardens in 1845. The air is thick, humid, almost difficult to breathe. The great palm house, newly built from iron and glass, glistens in the sunlight like a cathedral made of dew. Inside it is always summer. Condensation beads on every surface. The paths are narrow, the leaves enormous, banana, palm, rubber, coffee. The sound of dripping water echoes like a clock. And moving quietly between the rows are the gardeners. They wear linen shirts soaked through with sweat. They work barefoot, their hands wrapped in rags. Their task to keep alive the Empire's botany, specimens from Jamaica, Ceylon, Malaya and Australia, each tagged with Latin names and small brass numbers. They trim water and dust leaves that have never known English soil. They whisper to each other over the hiss of steam and the drone of flies. They are the Empire's quietest labourers, tending to beauty they will never own. To the visitors strolling outside in their fine coats, these gardens are a marvel. To the workers within, they are a kind of captivity. The unseen cost of Empire's garden Kew was not simply a public park. It was the Empire's biological armory, a place where plants were studied, bred, and prepared for export. In 1848, Kew's director Sir William Hooker oversaw the smuggling of tea plants from China to India, hidden inside Wardian cases. That single act would shift the center of the global tea trade, collapsing centuries of Chinese monopoly and laying the groundwork for British plantations in Assam and Darjeeling. The same method would later carry rubber trees from Brazil to Southeast Asia, igniting an economic revolution that would power factories, automobiles and industry, and destroy rainforests across 2 continents, all from a handful of seeds in glass boxes. But the gardeners who packed those cases, who kept the humidity perfect and the moss damp for months, were rarely named. They were apprentices, orphans, widows, and old men, labour hired for a few shillings a week. Some died of heat stroke, some of fungal infections, some simply faded away in the relentless green silence of their glass prison. There were no statues for them, no obituaries in the Times, only records, neat and bureaucratic, of losses due to illness and replacement staff procured. The fern craze. By the 1850s, the Wardian case had become more than a scientific tool. It was a fashion statement. Middle-class households across Britain filled their drawing rooms with ferns sealed inside delicate cases. Magazines published fern arranging guides. Wealthy women collected rare species the way others collected jewelry. The working-class gardeners who had once shipped plants for Empire now tended miniature jungles in aristocratic homes. It was called pteridamania, fern madness, The irony was sharp. What had begun as a tool of global exploitation became a domestic ornament. And yet, each fern still carried with it the story of empire, shipped from faraway colonies, grown in oppressive heat, displayed behind glass for admiration. The plant was alive but contained, just like the world it came from. The lost gardeners among the records at Kew. There are scattered mentions of men whose names never reached history books. Thomas Larkin, greenhouse labourer, 1842-1848, succumbed to fever. Eliza Dorr, female assistant, fern propagation, 1853-1857, dismissed for frailty. Boiler stoker, 1851, severe burns, deceased. Their handwriting still exists. Faint notes on watering schedules and leaf conditions, written in careful copperplate script. Their labour built the living museum that survives today. But their graves are unmarked, and their stories, like the condensation on glass, fade quickly after they appear. You can imagine them at dawn, stepping into the fogged glashhouses, the smell of soil and metal wrapping around them like a shroud, the first light of the morning catching on the glass panes above. The only sound, their own breathing and the rustle of leaves from another continent. A garden of control the Victorians loved order. To them, the Wardian case represented mastery over nature, distance, and decay. But in their pursuit of control, they built something fragile. The empire's plants could survive the ocean, but not always the humans who tended them. For every successful shipment of tea or rubber, dozens of boxes arrived dead, rotted from excess moisture, starved of air, or infected by unseen fungi. The gardeners bore the blame, though the problem was systemic. Instructions from above rarely matched the realities of heat and weather. And yet they persisted, repeating the same motions day after day, year after year. Because in Kew, as in all of empire, the system demanded silence, and the silence endured. A question in the glass when you stand in the Palm House today, a restored monument of green iron and glass, you can still feel the heaviness of the air. It is beautiful, yes, but oppressive too. You may look up and see the condensation dripping from the roof and wonder, how many unseen hands kept this place alive? How many breaths fogged this same glass before yours? The Wardian case promised immortality, a sealed, perfect world. But it also trapped the people who served it. And as you watch the ferns sway gently under the artificial heat, one question lingers. Imagine standing on the deck of a ship in 1852. The air smells of salt, pitch, and rope. Beneath your boots, the boards sweat with sea moisture. In the dim hold below, among barrels of coal, crates of textiles, and stacks of dried meat, lies something more precious than gold. A series of small glass boxes packed with moss and seedlings. Each is sealed tight. Each contains life. They are labelled in fine black ink Camellia sinensis, Assam trial specimens, tea plants, the empire's future in miniature. And nearby, watching over them, is a gardener from Kew, a man not listed on the ship's manifest as an officer or scientist, but as cargo attendant. His name, if you search the archives, would appear only once or twice, and never in bold. He is there for one reason only: to keep the plants alive. The great theft of tea. The year is 1848. In London, the directors of the East India Company sit in a candlelit boardroom. On the polished table before them lies a single Wardian case filled with young green shoots. These are not from India. They are stolen from China, smuggled out of the tea fields near Canton by Scottish botanist Robert Fortune under the guise of a Mandarin scholar. Fortune, with the help of disguised Chinese assistants, had packed thousands of seeds and cuttings into Wardian cases, sealing them for their secret journey to India. The goal was simple: break China's monopoly on tea, grow the same plant under British control in the hills of Assam and Darjeeling, control not just trade but taste itself. Ward's little invention, that glass box, had made this global heist possible. But someone had to ensure the plants survived the voyage of 40 days across the Indian Ocean, through storms, heat and salt. That duty fell to the quiet men of Kew. The ship's garden. Each ship that carried plants had what sailors called a green corner. It was usually built near the stern, where sunlight was strongest but sea spray least likely to intrude. Their rows of Wardian cases were stacked and tied down. Inside them, seedlings nestled in damp moss. The cases had to be turned occasionally so the light fell evenly. Condensation was watched with near religious care. Too little meant draught, too much meant rot. Every morning, the gardener would descend into the hold with a small brush, wiping away excess moisture, checking for mold, and listening to the creak of glass under pressure. The rest of the crew often mocked him. The leaf keeper, they'd call him, but even the roughest sailor knew better than to tamper with the cargo. The company paid bonuses for safe arrivals and fines for failure. So the man with the brush worked in silence, day after day, in a space that smelled of damp earth and seawater. Above him, the Empire sailed onward, its sails white and proud. Below, a quiet green world fought for breath. A voyage without wind, one of the earliest recorded voyages using Wardian cases, left London in 1849 aboard the Royal Saxon. It carried over 20 cases of tea seedlings bound for Calcutta. For the first 2 weeks, the weather was calm. Then came the doldrums, that terrible stillness of equatorial seas where the air itself seems to sleep. The sun burned. The ship barely moved. Inside the hold, the air grew unbearable. The glass cases began to fog so heavily that sunlight could no longer reach the plants. The gardener recorded that the condensation stood thick as frost upon the panes. He tried to vent the air, but opening the lids would break the seal, and with it, the entire experiment. So he waited helpless, as several of the plants wilted and turned brown. Later, when the ship caught wind again, the humidity corrected itself, and a few green leaves revived. That moment, though, was decisive. The Wardian case had proven it could work even under duress. Most of the cargo survived. Those survivors were planted in Assam the following year. The ancestors of the tea still grown there today. The gardener's name was not kept. Only his work endured. The labor behind the leaf, to the colonial officials in Calcutta, the arrival of the tea plants was an act of triumph. They had conquered distance. But for the men who had sailed with those boxes, it was simply another job, sweaty, repetitive, thankless. Once the ship docked, they were expected to clean the cases, re-water the moss, and oversee the transfer to the botanical gardens at Sibpur. The tropical heat was far worse than the English hothouses. Snakes hid among the boxes. Mold spread overnight. Several of the gardeners fell ill within weeks of arrival, their lungs weakened by years of damp air and spores. Their letters, when they wrote them, spoke not of glory, but of monotony. The boxes sweat always. The tea grows, but so too the sickness. Many never returned home. Those who did found their positions gone, their wages unpaid, their health too poor for steady work. The secret life of seeds. While the Empire celebrated its success with tea, other ships carried quieter, deadlier cargoes. In 1876, several Wardian cases left Para, Brazil, under heavy guard. Inside were rubber tree seeds, gathered illegally from the Amazon by Henry Wickham, another British adventurer in service of Empire, packed in damp clay, sealed tight, and labelled only as botanical specimens. They were shipped to Kew, then on to Ceylon and Malaya, where they sprouted into plantations that would change the modern world. The Amazon's monopoly collapsed. Within a generation, entire regions of Southeast Asia were covered in rubber trees, and entire generations of local labourers were bound to work under brutal colonial systems to harvest them, all from seeds that had crossed the sea in silence. And again, someone had tended those seeds during their voyage, brushing away the mould, turning the boxes, adjusting the moss. Someone without a name, without a record, without a monument. The breathing ship sailors came to call the plant decks, the breathing cargo. At night, when the hatches were closed, the air grew warm and fragrant, filled with the faint scent of sap and earth. Some said it made them dream differently, of forests, rain, and the buzzing of insects. Others hated it, claiming the smell of living boxes made the ship feel haunted. There were stories of cases breaking in storms, flooding the deck with mud and roots, of moss drying out and catching fire from lantern heat, of entire voyages lost to a single misjudged vent. But more often the voyages succeeded, plants lived, gardens grew, and the quiet machinery of Empire expanded. Arrival and aftermath. When the ships reached their destinations, the unloading was methodical. Each case was inspected, catalogued, and recorded by officials, while the gardeners stood aside, wary and sunburned. The plants were then sent to colonial gardens, Calcutta, Singapore, Penang, Peradania, each a mirror of Kew, each staffed by locals under the supervision of British botanists. The Wardian cases, now empty, were often discarded. Glass was too fragile to reuse, too expensive to carry back. Many were left to moulder in ports, their frames rusting in the tropical heat. But the plants, they survived, they flourished. And soon, Britain's empire no longer depended on trade with foreign powers for its luxuries. It grew them itself. The quiet collapsed. By the end of the century, the Wardian case began to fade from use. Steamships shortened voyages, refrigeration improved. The once revolutionary glass box was no longer needed. At Kew, thousands of unused cases gathered dust in storerooms. Some were broken down for parts. Others were given to schools or museums. The gardeners who had once guarded them at sea moved on, or faded into poverty. Their skills, precise and specialized, became obsolete. One retired worker interviewed in 1904 said we tended the Empire's lungs and then they stopped breathing us. It was true. The system that had relied on them had moved forward, leaving behind only their fingerprints on glass and their initials on shipping ledgers. The moral of the glass, the Wardian case, had promised preservation of plants, of life, of empire, but what it truly preserved was control. Each case was a miniature world, beautiful, sealed, obedient. Inside, nature obeyed the rules of the empire. It grew where it was told to grow, and in that sealed perfection perhaps was a mirror of Victorian ambition itself, pure, efficient, and quietly cruel. When the last cases were packed away, the world they had built remained plantations stretching from India to Ceylon to Africa, feeding industries that still run today, all born from a fern, a doctor's curiosity, and the patience of gardeners no one remembered. An unanswered question: if you walk the docks at Calcutta or the glashhouses at Kew today, you may find replicas of those cases, shining under museum light, admired as quaint inventions. But if you lean close, you might see your own reflection in the glass. You might see, behind it, the faint shapes of those who once watched the same surface for signs of life. In the last years of the 19th century, the Palm House at Kew was already considered old-fashioned. Its iron ribs had rusted at the joints, the glass panes were clouded with age. Outside, London had changed. Soot from factories blackened the sky, and electric lights glowed faintly through the smog. But inside the Palm House, time moved differently. The air was thick and wet, always the same temperature. Moss crept up the stone edges of the paths. Water dripped in perfect rhythm from the pipes above. It could have been 1850 or 1750 or yesterday, and in that humid quiet, a few remaining gardeners carried on as if nothing outside the glass had changed. They were old now, their bodies bent and slow. They remembered when the glashhouses had been alive with visitors and officials, when every fern, every sapling had been a matter of imperial pride. Now, the empire itself was shifting, and the world no longer seemed to need their touch. But still, each morning they opened the doors, wiped the condensation from the glass, and began again. The end of containment by 1905, the Wardian case had disappeared from serious botanical use. Faster ships, refrigeration, and industrial greenhouses made long-distance transport easier. Kew Gardens had become more a museum than a laboratory, a place for Sunday strolls and polite lectures, not the nerve center of empire it had once been. The remaining gardeners were given new tasks: maintaining display plants, arranging floral exhibitions, trimming decorative hedges. Their world of precise humidity and night, long care had ended. Some took pride in the stillness, others felt erased. One man, Arthur Fenwick, wrote in his small journal, "One no longer ship the world's life across the seas. We tend what's left of it, here, in glass coffins." The phrase, glass coffins, caught on quietly among the workers. They began to call the Palm House that, half in jest, half in mourning, because it wasn't just plants that were being preserved now. It was a memory, sealed behind panes of Victorian ambition, the quiet rebellion of decay. As the 20th century began, Britain's colonies pushed toward independence. Plantations still produced tea and rubber, but the profits flowed differently. At Kew, funding waned. Maintenance slowed. Small things, unnoticeable at first, began to fail. Condensation dripped onto the wrong leaves. Algae grew thick in the pools. The delicate balance of the greenhouse, once kept perfect by endless, invisible labor, began to tilt. But the old gardeners refused to give in. Each evening, as the visitors left, they walked the paths with small lamps, inspecting every corner for rot. They whispered to the plants as they watered them, as if trying to keep them from realizing the empire had moved on. You can imagine them there, stooped, silent figures moving under the green shadow of banana leaves, surrounded by the ghosts of work that no longer mattered. To them, the glashhouse wasn't a museum. It was a living world, one that needed them even if no one else did. The forgotten correspondence. In 1923, a bundle of old letters was found in one of Kew's storage sheds, sealed in a rusted tin box. They had belonged to Thomas Larkin, one of the earliest gardeners who'd worked with Wardian cases in the 1840s. Most of the letters were unsent drafts, written to his wife, to the directors, to himself. In one, he described the feeling of tending plants destined never to be seen again. "They say we move the world's green wealth, but we do not move ourselves. I have watched more leaves live than men." Another read: "Sometimes I think the glass is meant not to preserve the plant, but to keep us from it. We are kept apart by our own invention." Those letters were quietly archived, not studied, not published. Too melancholy perhaps for the narrative of progress, but within them, you can hear the core truth of the Wardian case. It preserved life by keeping it separate. And in doing so, it mirrored the empire that created it, vibrant, global, and entirely dependent on boundaries. From empire to garden after the First World War, Kew's role changed again. Britain no longer ruled the seas as it once had. The colonies demanded autonomy, and the old trade networks began to unravel. Kew became an institution of learning, a research centre, a place to catalogue biodiversity rather than control it. Students came to study botany, tourists came to admire the palms. But the gardeners, the last of the old class of manual caretakers, found themselves surrounded by new kinds of people. Scientists spoke in Latin, administrators counted budgets. The quiet hands-on work of watering, pruning, and watching for rot felt almost medieval in this new world of modernity. Still, they stayed. They stayed because they loved the smell of soil, the condensation on glass, the small miracles that still happened every morning. A seed splitting open, a leaf unfurling, a root finding water. Progress had left them behind, but nature had not. The silence beneath the glass. By the 1930s, most of the original Palm House staff had died or retired. Their replacements came from the new horticultural schools, young men in clean uniforms, with thermometers and notebooks instead of rags and instinct. They were taught the science of growth, not the patience of it. They measured humidity, logged temperatures, and treated the plants as data. It worked in a way. The collections flourished. The tropical flowers bloomed more evenly than ever before. But something intangible was lost. The rhythm of care, the slow breathing partnership between plant and hand. A visitor in 1938 described the Palm House as impeccably tended yet strangely lifeless. Perhaps she was right. When the last of the empire's gardeners was gone, the plants survived, but the soul of the place seemed to dim. The war years, when the Second World War reached London, Kew was struck by bombs more than once. Several glashhouses shattered under the blast, rare palms were lost to fire. During the nights of the Blitz, volunteers, many of them former gardeners, came to guard the remaining houses, bucket in hand, ready to douse sparks. They said the Palm House breathed smoke and steam like a wounded beast. One elderly caretaker, who had once worked the green decks of a transport ship half a century earlier, stood through the bombing, refusing to leave. When asked why, he simply said, "I've kept things alive through worse air than this." When the war ended, much of Kew was rebuilt. But those who had stood watch through the fires were not commemorated. History rarely records the hands that keep life going while others destroy it. The Museum of the Living in the post-war decades, the Wardian case became a curiosity again, displayed in glass cabinets as a relic of Victorian ingenuity. Visitors would read the plaques and smile, admiring its quaintness. Few realized that the world outside, filled with global trade, genetically modified crops, refrigerated transport, was still built on the same principle: control life in transit. Every banana, every cut flower, every packet of tea that crossed an ocean was a descendant of those first glass boxes. But for the gardeners of Kew, that connection was invisible. They had become caretakers of memory, not of empire. The last greenhouse keeper in 1956, Kew employed one of its last full-time manual greenhouse keepers, George Allerton, a man in his 70s who had begun as an apprentice before the Great War. He refused to use the new mechanized watering system, preferring his old copper can. Every morning, he would test the humidity with his cheek, not a device, but a feeling. A colleague once found him standing in front of a Wardian case on display in the museum wing, staring at his own reflection in the glass. When asked what he saw, he said quietly, "Use inside it. Always have been." He died a few years later. His obituary was a paragraph in a local paper. But if you walk through Kew on a warm day, when the air inside the Palm House grows heavy and the sunlight breaks through the glass in long, humid beams, you might imagine him still there, watering in silence. The legacy of contained life, the Wardian case, was more than a curiosity. It was a prototype for the modern world, for greenhouses, laboratories, even spacecraft. The same idea, a self-contained, self-sustaining environment, would later guide the construction of biospheres and space capsules. The dream of control never died, it only changed form. But what was lost, perhaps forever, was the slow companionship of human and plant, the shared endurance of those who lived their lives between condensation and leaf. The empire faded, the cases cracked, but the idea of containment survived. And with it, the quiet question that has haunted every age since: can something truly live when it is never allowed to touch the world? Epilogue. Under glass today, if you visit Kew Gardens, the Palm House stands bright again. Restored, polished, preserved, a monument to Victorian ambition and global curiosity. You can walk its paths, touch the railings, feel the same heavy warmth that generations once breathed. The ferns sway, the air hums. But look closer, at the fog glass, at the rivulets of water tracing paths down the panes. Each drop carries the memory of another time, the deck of a ship, the sweat of a gardener, the sigh of a world that thought it could hold nature in its hands. And if you listen long enough, you may hear it. The faintest sound of cloth against leaf, the whisper of someone saying, "Careful now, she's alive." Because under glass everything still breathes, even the past. If you had walked through the streets of Lancashire in the 1840s, before dawn had fully broken, you would have heard it before you saw it, a low, continuous hum, like distant thunder that never stopped. It was the sound of the looms, thousands of them, clattering and shuddering behind brick walls, shaking the ground, filling the air with a ceaseless rhythm that defined the life of the industrial North. And moving toward that sound, wrapped in shawls against the cold morning, were the women. They came from terraced houses that all looked the same, narrow, damp, soot-streaked, and pressed so close together that the windows stared into each other. The streets smelled of smoke and rain and starch. The women carried tin pails of weak tea and bread, sometimes an onion, sometimes nothing at all. At 6 in the morning, the mill gates opened, and they entered. Inside, the world changed. The air was hot and thick with fiber dust, so thick that the light turned milky as it passed through. The machines filled the room like beasts, long lines of spinning frames and power looms stretching into the gloom. The sound was a wall, a deafening roar that made speech impossible. They tied their hair up tight, covered their mouths with cloth, and began the day's work. The empire of cotton, the British Empire, in its most powerful century, rested on cotton. Not gold, not silver, not even coal, but the soft, white fiber that clothed half the world. The raw cotton came from across the ocean, from the plantations of the American South, where enslaved people picked it under the same sun that had burned the backs of their ancestors. Ships carried it to Liverpool, then trains hauled it inland to Manchester and the mill towns of Lancashire. There, the women turned it into thread and cloth, the final step of a global chain of suffering and profit. A single spool of thread in a shop window might have crossed oceans and endured storms, passed through hands that would never meet. A slave's, a sailor's, a spinner's, a merchant's, all before it reached a lady's needle in London. The women in the mills rarely thought about that chain. They didn't have time to. Their world was measured in hours, in shifts, in the small rituals of endurance that made the day survivable. The factory day at 6, the looms began. At 8, a 10-minute break for breakfast, usually eaten standing, between machines. At 12, a half-hour for dinner. At 7 in the evening, the machines stopped. 13 hours, 6 days a week. A good spinner could manage 6 to 8 looms at once, darting between them, watching for breaks in the threads, adjusting tension. The work required constant attention. A moment of distraction could mean a snapped warp, or worse, a crushed hand. Accidents were common. The machines were unguarded, the belts fast moving. A sleeve caught, a finger trapped, a moment's hesitation, and the damage was done. But the worst harm wasn't visible. The air itself was deadly. Cotton dust filled the lungs, coating the throat and chest. By 30, many women coughed constantly. By 40, some couldn't climb the stairs. It was called mill fever. But it wasn't a fever at all. It was bisonosis, the slow suffocation of those who breathe cotton for a living. A world of women in the spinning rooms. Women outnumbered men 3 to 1. They came young, 12, 13, sometimes younger, and stayed until marriage, or until their bodies failed them. Some returned even after childbirth, bringing infants to the mill nursery if they were lucky enough to work for an owner who provided one. They were quick, disciplined, and paid less than men, which made them ideal in the eyes of the factory owners. But they weren't silent. The women of Lancashire developed a unique strength, not the loud, political kind, but the kind that endures. They shared bread, patched each other's shawls, and spoke in gestures more than words. A hand on a shoulder meant, "Thank you." A glance meant, "Watch that thread." A nod meant, "We'll get through it." And when the time came to speak out, they did. The Mill Union in 1833, Parliament passed the Factory Act, limiting child labour and mandating short breaks. But it did little for adult women. Wages stayed low, conditions stayed deadly. By the 1840s, whispers of union reached even the spinning floors. At first it seemed impossible. How could women, forbidden to gather during work hours, organise under such conditions? But they found a way. After shifts, they met in kitchens and back rooms, passing word quietly, writing petitions by candlelight. One of them, Esther Eccles, became known among the spinners for her calm, unwavering voice. She couldn't read or write, but she could remember every clause of the new factory bill better than the overseers could. She stood on a stool once in a room filled with tired women and said, "We do the work that clothes the world, yet we are clothed in dust." The line spread through the mills. A whisper, a kind of quiet anthem. They weren't fighting for revolution, they were fighting for air. The overseers' every spinning room had its hierarchy. At the top were the owners, often invisible, living in large houses far from the mills. Then came the overlookers, men who enforced speed and discipline. They were feared, but also pitied. Many had once been workers themselves. They carried the bitterness of survival. An overlooker's whistle could cut through the roar of the machines. A signal to fix a broken line, to move faster, to keep silent. Most followed orders without cruelty. But a few enjoyed the power the noise gave them. There are records of women being fined for idleness if they paused to stretch or drink water. A single mistake, a tangled thread, a dropped spool, could cost half a day's pay. In the noise and heat, small humiliations went unnoticed by the world outside. But among the women, memory was long. They remembered every slight, every unfair deduction, every threat. And though they said nothing aloud, they found quiet ways to resist. A machine left unthreaded for a few moments longer than necessary. A spool swapped, just enough to slow production. A cough that turned into a pause, and a pause that spread through the room. Small acts, invisible ones. But in a world where every minute was owned, even seconds of silence felt like rebellion. The smell of oil and steam, the mills were built for efficiency, not comfort. The floors were soaked with oil to reduce friction, and the smell of it mingled with sweat, dust, and steam. Light came from gas lamps, flickering through the haze. When the windows were opened, which was rare, the outside air felt cold and sharp, almost alien. At noon, the women sat on overturned boxes or against the walls, eating what they could afford: bread, cheese, sometimes cold potatoes. Laughter was rare but not absent. Someone might tell a story about a broken machine, or a courtship, or a dream that they could one day open a shop. The noise outside, the looms, the pulleys, the belts, never fully stopped. It was like a heartbeat that the town itself had grown dependent on. Children in their cradles learned to sleep through it. The silence of Sunday mornings, when the mills closed, felt almost unnatural, as if the world had stopped breathing. The weighing room each Saturday, the women lined up in the weighing room to collect their wages. The overseer sat behind a high desk, his ledger open, counting coins into calloused hands. The pay was precise, often to the halfpenny. Deductions were made for lateness, for broken threads, for damaged cloth. Some weeks, a woman might walk home with less than she'd earned the week before, without explanation. Yet for many, this was the only money they ever controlled themselves. A shilling could mean candles for the week, or soap, or a new ribbon for Sunday. A few pence, saved carefully, might one day mean a piece of furniture, a winter coat, a little independence. That independence mattered. In a time when a woman's world was meant to be her home, the mills gave her wages. And with them, a quiet kind of freedom. The quiet after the shift, when the day ended, the women walked home together. The streets were grey with dusk, and the air smelled of coal. They passed the pub where men drank loudly, past the chapel, where the preacher warned of vanity and sin, past the bakery, where the last loaves cooled in the window. Home was a small room with a stove and a basin. The sound of the looms still rang in their ears. Some said it never left, even in sleep. They undid their shawls, wiped the oil from their hands, and sat in silence. Sometimes they mended their clothes. Sometimes they simply stared into the small flame of the fire. Outside, the smoke from the chimneys drifted upward, blending into the night. Tomorrow, it would begin again. A whisper in the dust. By the 1850s, reforms began to reach the mills: shorter hours, inspections, cleaner air. But progress was slow. For every new rule, there was a way to ignore it. And still, the women worked. They outlasted owners, laws, and machines. Their strength wasn't in defiance or speeches, but in repetition, in the quiet endurance of those who kept turning the wheels of history. The world called it progress. For them, it was survival. And yet, when you stand today in the ruins of an old Lancashire mill, when you hear the faint drip of water through brick, and the wind that moves through the broken windows, you can almost imagine the sound that once filled this place. The hum of the looms, the rhythm of footsteps, the steady, tireless breath of thousands of women who built the modern age, one thread at a time. They were never famous. Most names are lost, but the world still wears their work. By the 1850s, Lancashire's cotton mills were the beating heart of Britain's industry, and its most fragile organ. Every bolt of cloth that left Manchester, Bolton, Oldham, and Preston carried within it both pride and strain. The women who spun and wove that cloth had grown up inside the sound of machines. They knew their rhythm by heart. But beneath that rhythm, another sound was growing, a whisper of unrest. The looms and the law. When the 10 Hours Act was passed in 1847, it was meant to bring mercy. It limited the working day for women and children to 10 hours, an improvement on the exhausting 13 or 14-hour shifts that had defined their lives. But the mills were reluctant to obey. Owners adjusted the machines, tightened production schedules, and demanded that workers speed up to meet the same output in less time. The law had changed, but the pace had not. Inspectors came and went, noting only what they were allowed to see. The rooms were cleaned for their visits, the youngest children hidden. The windows opened just enough to make the air seem breathable. When the inspectors left, the windows closed again. The machines roared back to life. The women began to understand what their mothers had not, that laws were only as strong as those willing to stand by them. And so they began to organize. Quietly at first, then together. The Preston lockout in 1853, the cotton industry faced a downturn. Prices fell, demand slowed. Mill owners cut wages by 10%. In Preston, the women refused. They didn't call it a strike at first. That word was dangerous, linked to sedition and criminality. They called it staying away. On a grey morning in February, hundreds of workers did not report for their shift. The looms stood silent for the first time in years. The overseers waited, expecting them to return by afternoon. They did not. By the week's end, 20,000 mill workers, men, women, and children, had joined the walkout. It became one of the largest labour disputes of the Victorian era. The silence that spoke. The women of Preston had little in the way of power. They couldn't vote. They owned no property. Most could barely afford coal for their stoves, but they could stop the looms. And in doing so, they revealed something that frightened the mill owners more than rebellion itself: dependence. Without the women, there was no cloth. Without the cloth, there was no empire. The stay away spread to neighbouring towns. Spinners and weavers formed committees, raised money for food, wrote letters to London newspapers. In one such letter, signed simply, "A working woman of Lancashire," the writer said, "They call us idle, but who turns the wheel when we stand still? Let them come and see the dust we breathe before they measure our worth in pennies." It was a quiet kind of defiance, articulate, restrained, and devastating. Hard days. The lockout dragged on for 7 months. Without wages, hunger came quickly. Women sold what little they owned: furniture, blankets, even shoes. Charitable kitchens opened, serving thin soup and bread. Some men urged a return to work, arguing that starvation was worse than injustice. But many women refused. Their pride was quiet but unyielding. They had spent their lives following rules set by others. Fathers, overseers, laws written in rooms they would never see. For once, they chose silence as their weapon. The mills stayed empty. Even the constant hum of the town, the sound that had become its heartbeat, was gone. People said it felt like the air itself had stopped moving. Esther Eccles and the Women's Union. Among the women leading the Preston strike was Esther Eccles, a spinner remembered by later unionists as the calm one. She was neither loud nor angry. She simply refused to be moved. When asked by a local magistrate why she would risk prison, she replied, "Because the air is not worth breathing if we must sell it too." Her leadership was practical rather than poetic. She organized food collections, kept attendance lists, and made sure no woman stood alone when called before the mill masters. When newspapers came to write about the strike, they focused on the men. The speeches, the confrontations, the banners, but in the kitchens and alleys, it was the women who kept the strike alive. They watched one another's children, shared food, and delivered letters between towns. They wove, in their own way, a network stronger than any loom. The mill masters replied by summer. The owners were desperate. Idle mills meant idle profits. They posted notices offering re-employment to anyone who would return to work at the reduced rate. A few accepted, driven by hunger, but many mills remained half empty. The owners petitioned Parliament, arguing that the women were being messled by agitators. They claimed that their concern was paternal, that they merely sought to restore order to the industrious classes. It was the old argument that obedience was a form of gratitude. But in the quiet homes of Preston, where mothers fed children water, thin broth, and told stories by the dim light of a single candle, gratitude had worn thin. They no longer believed that obedience was survival. Winter without work, the winter of 1853-54 was bitter. Snow gathered on the roofs of the empty mills, muffling the world in silence. Hunger became normal, so did the taste of defeat. Yet still they waited. One by one, small mills began to reopen, some agreeing to partial restoration of wages, others forced to close entirely. The Preston strike ended, not with victory or surrender, but with exhaustion. Some women returned to the looms. Others never did. But something had changed. Something invisible, something lasting. They had learned that silence could be a form of speech, that unity could exist without words or banners. They had learned, above all, that the mill was not eternal. Aftermath and memory, the strike left scars, both visible and not. Families were broken by debt, children malnourished. Yet within a decade, those same women became the foundation of a new labour movement in 1860, when the Lancashire cotton famine struck, caused by the American Civil War and the blockade of southern cotton. Thousands of workers faced unemployment again. This time, they organised faster. They petitioned the government for relief funds, opened co-operative stores, and refused to riot, choosing dignity over chaos. Even Queen Victoria noted their restraint, calling them the most patient people in the kingdom. It wasn't patience, it was endurance. The women of Lancashire had learned long ago how to endure without breaking. The forgotten songs, few records survive of the songs the women sang in the mills. But fragments remain, lines scribbled in diaries, overheard by travellers. One verse, preserved in an 1854 report, went, "The looms are stopped, the wheels are still, but hearts can weave though hands be chill." The songs were soft, often wordless, blending with the hum of the machines. They weren't protest songs in the modern sense. They were survival songs. Rhythms to pace the day, to remind one another that they were still there, still human, beneath the roar of the looms. When the machines stopped during the strike, the absence of those songs was perhaps the most haunting silence of all. The machinery of change. By the late 19th century, the world of the mills began to change. Automatic looms replaced hand-guided ones, ventilation improved, laws tightened. But the real change had already begun decades earlier, in the minds of those who realized that endurance itself could be power. The women who had once been nameless spinners became the mothers and grandmothers of union organizers, suffragists and reformers. Their daughters attended school. Their granddaughters voted. Each thread they had spun, each piece of cloth that had wrapped the empire, carried within it the memory of a generation that refused to stay invisible. The weight of quiet power. When we think of revolutions, we imagine noise, crowds, speeches, banners in the wind. But in the mills of Lancashire, the revolution was quiet. It happened in the stillness between shifts, in the decision not to bow one's head, in the refusal to return when the wage was unjust. It happened in kitchens where women shared crusts of bread and whispered, "Not yet." History records battles and laws, but not these moments. Yet without them, the modern world, the world of fair wages, safety standards, and weekends, could not exist. Every reform began as a whisper in the dust. The return of sound. When the looms finally started again after the Preston strike, the noise must have sounded different. For years it had been a sound of servitude. Now, it carried something else. Ownership, maybe. Awareness. Each beat of the shuttle across the warp was no longer just production, it was presence. The machines might have belonged to the owners, but the rhythm belonged to the women. They had claimed it, not through rebellion or rhetoric, but through survival itself. The air grows thick again in your imagination. The threads pull taut, the wheels turn. But listen closer, not to the machines, but to the pauses between them. That is where history lives. In the spaces where ordinary people decide, without anyone's permission, that enough is enough. By the end of the 19th century, the cotton towns of northern England were both ancient and new. The mills still stood, tall, red, and stern against the grey sky, but the world they had built was changing beneath them. The empire was shifting its focus. Other nations, India, Egypt, America, had begun to weave their own cotton. Machines were faster, labour cheaper, and the future seemed to be elsewhere. In Lancashire, the air no longer trembled with the same ceaseless rhythm. There were still mornings when the looms thundered, but between the noise came something unfamiliar: silence. For the first time in living memory, silence had returned to the mill towns. The empty shifts. In 1892, a reporter visited Oldham and wrote, "It is as though the town itself is holding its breath." He described rows of mills with broken windows, machinery left idle, and workers waiting at the gates. hoping for the bell that never rang. Many of the old spinners, the women who had once led the strikes, who had lived their lives by the turn of the wheel, were gone. Some had died young, lungs full of dust. Others had married, moved south, or emigrated to America, where new factories promised steady pay. Those who remained found the silence unbearable. Too quiet. One old woman said to another, standing in the empty yard. The hum of the looms had been a kind of heartbeat, a rhythm that measured time and purpose. Without it, life felt untethered. They missed the noise, not the labor, not the exhaustion, but the certainty. The children who stayed for the next generation. The mills were no longer a promise but a warning. By the 1920s, children of the mill women had choices their mothers could never have imagined. Some became clerks, teachers, shop assistants. Others joined the railway or worked in the new electrical plants. Yet even they spoke of the mills as if they were sacred ruins. One daughter of a spinner, interviewed in 1934, recalled, "When I was little, I thought the noise in the mill was what kept the world alive. I thought if it stopped, everything would stop with it." When the mills did stop, for weeks, then months, she said it felt as though the world had gone hollow. The empire had been built on motion. Now it was learning how to stand still. The cotton famine remembered for the older generation, silence was not new. They remembered another silence, one born not of decay, but of absence, the Lancashire cotton famine of the 1860s. When the American Civil War cut off supplies of southern cotton, the mills had gone still for nearly 3 years. Tens of thousands were thrown out of work. Soup kitchens returned. Children scavenged coal from slag heaps. And yet, during that crisis, the women of Lancashire had refused to call for the end of the Union blockade. They supported Lincoln's cause, the abolition of slavery, even though it meant their own hunger. They wrote letters of sympathy to America. Lincoln himself thanked them in 1863, calling their stance an instance of sublime Christian heroism. That memory lived on, proof that even in the depths of need, morality had not been entirely consumed by the machine. But by the turn of the century, such stories felt like relics. The new crisis was not moral, but mechanical. The world was simply moving on. The new machines, electricity, came to the mills at the dawn of the 20th century. The old belts and pulleys, once driven by water wheels and steam, were replaced with small motors. The air grew cleaner, the rooms brighter. For a brief time, production boomed again. Wages rose. Optimism returned. But it was short-lived. India, long the empire's greatest customer, was now producing its own textiles. Japan's factories were faster and more efficient. Even in Britain, fashion was changing. Cheaper fabrics, synthetic blends, imported silks. Lancashire's mastery of cotton had become a monument to a different age. The women still working in the mills began to notice the changes before the men did. They saw the looms sitting idle, the new machines running only half the day. They knew, in the way only workers know, when the world was about to shift beneath them. And so they began, once again, to adapt. The weavers' daughters in the interwar years, mill work became a matter of pride rather than necessity. Young women entered the trade not because they had to, but because it connected them to their mothers and grandmothers, a heritage of endurance. They spoke of keeping the looms alive, as if tending to a dying relative. One weaver, Annie Holden, told a local historian in 1931, "My gran worked these looms before the strike, my mam during the famine, and I'll not be the one to let them go cold." But as the depression deepened, more and more looms did go cold. Entire wings of mills were shuttered. Others were dismantled for scrap. The towns darkened again. Not with soot this time, but with quiet. The sound of memory. The women who had spent their youth inside the roar of the mills carried that sound with them. Long after retirement, they said they could still hear it in their sleep. The hum of machinery, the hiss of steam, the rhythmic thump of the shuttle. Doctors called it mill tinnitus. The women called it ghost sound. It wasn't unpleasant, they said. It was company. A reminder that once they had belonged to something vast, a rhythm greater than themselves. To fall asleep to that imagined sound was to fall back into time, into the world where their strength had meaning, and their hands could still make the world turn. The museum years, by the mid-20th century, the mills had become museums. In Manchester, Burnley and Bolton, old looms were cleaned, oiled, and preserved as heritage exhibits. School children came to watch the machines operate, their noise startling in a world of cars and radios. The guides were often the old women themselves, retired spinners who explained the process with quiet pride. They would smile as the machines started up, the old hum filling the air once more. But when asked if they missed it, their faces softened. "You can't miss what never really leaves you," one said. "The sound's still there, only quieter now." Well, the towns that wait today, many of those towns remain. Rows of brick houses, narrow canals, tall chimneys without smoke. If you walk through them in the evening, you can still sense the weight of what once was the rhythm, the heat, the ceaseless labor. The mills are apartments now, or shopping arcades. Some stand empty, windows broken, ivy creeping over their walls. But beneath that stillness lies a kind of pulse, the memory of endurance. The women who built this place, who filled the world with cloth, who turned dust into sustenance, may be gone. Yet their legacy remains in every seam, every thread, every folded fabric that still carries the scent of industry. The hum of the looms has become the hum of electricity, the low murmur of cities at night. Different machines, same rhythm. The inheritance of quiet. What did those women leave behind? Not monuments, not statues, but a certain kind of strength, invisible, practical, ordinary. It's in the woman who stands long hours at a shop counter. It's in the nurse who wakes before dawn, the cleaner who locks up after dark, the mother who works 2 jobs without complaint. The endurance that built the mills did not vanish. It simply changed shape. The same patience that kept the threads from snapping now holds together the fabric of modern life. And though the world has forgotten their names, their rhythm remains, in every hum of progress, in every breath between work and rest. The last loom in 1989, in a small Lancashire town called Queen Street, the last working cotton mill in England, stopped for the final time. The manager, an old man who had started as a weaver's apprentice, stood beside the last loom as it slowed. He said later, "When the sound stopped, I realized it was the quietest I had ever heard the world." The women who had worked there came to watch. They brought their grandchildren. When the machine stopped, they applauded softly. Some wept, then they went home. Because that's what mill women had always done. They finished the day, no matter how the day ended. The loom's in our dreams now, if you listen closely in the quiet hours of night, when traffic fades, when the world has gone still. You might hear something faint and familiar, not quite a hum, not quite a rhythm, a ghost of machinery, somewhere deep in the collective memory of the world. It is the sound of motion, of endurance, of countless hands that turned the wheel before us. And if you hear it, do not be afraid. It is not haunting. It is history, still working, still breathing, still weaving us together. It is London 1825. The city is a maze of shadows and gaslight, its streets alive with both movement and silence. By day it roars, carts clattering, bells ringing, traders shouting. But by midnight London transforms. The great capital of the empire becomes a place of whispers. The smell of coal hangs thick in the air, the fog rolling low from the Thames. Shop shutters are drawn tight, carriages few, and the city's remaining inhabitants, the poor, the lost, and the restless, begin to move unseen. And through it all, pacing steadily with lanterns in hand, are the watchmen, men paid to stay awake while the rest of the world sleeps. A city that never slept before the Metropolitan Police were founded in 1829. The streets of London were patrolled by a patchwork of night watchmen, some hired by parishes, others by private subscription. They were the city's earliest form of policing, though calling them police would have made most Londoners laugh. The night watch was a medieval institution, older than the city's gaslights and nearly as old as the walls themselves. Every parish had its own men, its own lanterns, and its own system of keeping time. In some districts the watch was respected, men of modest honour keeping order in the dark. In others, it was a farce. Old half-deaf men, leaning on halberds, dozing in doorways, paid a few shillings a week to call the hours and chase off drunks. Charles Dickens, who had walked the streets himself, described them with both affection and mockery. Old men with lanterns that flickered more than shone, calling out the hour in cracked voices that seemed half ghost, half clock. But whether they were sharp or slow, honest or indolent, the watchmen were the pulse of the sleeping city. The routine of the watch, a watchman's night, began at 9 o'clock, when the bells tolled across London. They met in small parish stations, often little more than a shed beside the churchyard, where they collected their staves, rattles, and oil lanterns. Each man was assigned a beat, a circuit of streets he was expected to walk every hour until dawn. The rules were simple: keep moving, call the hour, report fires, fights, or felonies, stay sober. The reality was different. Many of the watchmen were elderly labourers or wounded veterans of old wars. Some were missing fingers, others teeth, and a few entire legs. They moved slowly, leaning on their staffs, their lanterns swinging like pendulums in the mist. They were to call the time every hour, past 10 o'clock, and a cloudy night, both to mark the passing of hours and to prove they were still awake. Londoners grew used to those voices, thin, nasal cries echoing through narrow lanes, mingling with the sound of distant horses or the occasional crash of a late-night drunkard. The city slept, but it slept lightly. The tools of the trade each watchman carried three things: a staff or truncheon, carved from ash wood and capped with brass, a symbol of office and a weapon of necessity, a rattle made of wood and iron, loud enough to wake an entire street when spun, the alarm of its age, a lantern fueled by whale oil or later gas, with a glass front that threw pale light across the cobbles. Some carried whistles, though these were more for show than sound. Others had handcuffs or rope, but few ever used them. A watchman's most important tool was his voice. To call out the hour was to mark one's presence, to keep both criminals and the fearful at bay. Past 11 o'clock, and all's well. It was a lie, of course. All was rarely well in London after dark. But the phrase carried comfort, a reassurance that someone, at least, was watching. The city beneath the fog, the London they patrolled, was not the polished city of palaces and theatres. It was a darker labyrinth, damp alleys, half-paved courts, and open sewers. In the East End, sailors stumbled home from the docks, pockets full of wages and danger. In St. Giles, gin flowed like water, and the poor slept six to a room in cellars where rats feasted freely. Along Fleet Street, printing presses clattered late into the night, their owners bribing the watchmen for silence. To walk those streets required endurance, but not courage in the heroic sense. A quieter, heavier kind of bravery. Watchmen were often mocked for their slowness, but their job was thankless. They faced drunks, thieves, fires, and the bitter cold, all for a wage that barely bought bread. One contemporary remarked, "They are neither feared by rogues nor thanked by the honest." Still, they kept walking, hour after hour, year after year. The sounds of night. Imagine standing in the doorway of a London lodging house in 1825. The street is empty but alive with sound, the drip of rain from a roof, the distant hooves of a late night carriage, the faint call past 1 o'clock, and a fine night. You might hear the creak of a watchman's boots as he passes, lantern light flickering on the wet stones. He glances your way, nods, and keeps moving. Behind him the fog closes in again. That small moment, brief, ordinary, was the sum of his existence. He would walk 100 nights like that, perhaps 1,000, unseen, unnamed, unremembered, and yet without him, the city would have felt far lonelier. The jests and the jeers, the public had mixed feelings about their guardians. To the poor, the watchmen were familiar, sometimes friendly, sometimes meddling. To the wealthy, they were an inconvenience. They were caricatured in prints and plays, fat, sleepy, leaning on their staffs while thieves slipped past. Old Charlies, people called them, a nickname both affectionate and cruel. Children imitated their cries for fun. Drunks tried to steal their lanterns. Street dogs followed them on their rounds. And yet, when trouble came, when fire broke out or thieves attacked, it was often these same mocked men who ran first toward the danger. Many died quietly, names unrecorded, from exposure, disease, or violence. Their graves, when they had them, bore no titles, only parish stones worn smooth by rain. The dawn and the bell at 5 in the morning. The first bells of London began to ring again. The watchmen, stiff and weary, returned to their stations to sign their names, or more often, to make an X. Some dozed in their chairs, boots steaming beside the fire. Others went home through the waking streets, blending back into the life of the city as if they had never been awake at all. Their shift ended as the rest of London's began. By 7, the milk carts were rolling, the markets shouting, and the watchmen, those invisible keepers of order, were asleep in narrow beds above taverns and tenements. The coming of change, but their time was ending. By the late 1820s, London was too vast, too complex, and too dangerous for such a scattered system. The Home Secretary, Sir Robert Peel, saw the city's future differently. He envisioned an organised, professional police, men in uniform, trained and disciplined, who would patrol by both day and night. When Peel's Metropolitan Police were founded in 1829, many of the old watchmen were replaced. Some were offered new posts as constables. Others, too old or too proud, refused. They watched as their lanterns were taken away, their stations shuttered, their rounds assigned to younger men in blue coats. The age of the parish watch was over. A slow vanishing no one noticed when the last of the old watchmen died. There was no ceremony, no monument. Their names faded from the rolls, their stations were torn down, and their tools sold for scrap. But in certain quiet corners of London, narrow alleys near Holborn, damp lanes in Southwark. People said that for years afterward, they could still hear the faint echo of the old call in the fog. Past 12 o'clock and all's well. Perhaps it was only imagination, or perhaps some voices linger longer than their owners. A city that never truly sleeps in many ways, London today still belongs to the night watch. Security guards walk their rounds in shopping centres, hospitals and office towers. Quiet figures with radios instead of rattles, flashlights instead of lanterns. They too pace through silence, unseen and uncelebrated. They too hold the strange patience of those who keep the world safe while others dream. The tools have changed. The rhythm has not. And if you listen closely in the dark, through the hum of distant traffic, you might almost hear it still, past midnight, and all's well. By the end of the 1820s, the old order of London's streets was falling apart. The city had grown far beyond anything its medieval systems could handle. In 1801, London held about 1 million people. By 1830, it held nearly 2. The streets were choked with smoke, filth and movement. Carts, animals, beggars, pickpockets, sailors, and merchants all moving through a labyrinth that had no single hand to guide it. There were still watchmen, of course. Hundreds of them. Each parish ran its own, each with its own captain, its own hours, and its own rules. But there was no unity. A thief could commit a crime in Westminster, run across a bridge into Southwark, and vanish into a different jurisdiction entirely. It was, quite literally, a city where the law ended at the parish line. And into this confusion stepped Sir Robert Peel, a man who believed the night itself could be tamed. The problem of disorder. In 1828, a parliamentary committee issued a report on the state of crime and policing in London. It was damning. Fires broke out nightly, street robberies were rampant, and in the poorer districts, the watchmen were little more than spectators. The report noted one especially telling example. A watchman, finding a man beating another in Holborn, did call out that he would fetch assistance, and walk to the nearest alehouse to do so. Another fell asleep beside a lamp post and was found, lantern still burning, while pickpockets worked within sight of him. The city laughed at such stories, but Peel did not. He believed the system was failing not because the men were bad, but because it was built for another age. A slower, smaller, sleepier London. The old watch was made for parish lanes and quiet markets. The new city needed something larger, something awake. A radical idea. In 1829, Peel presented to Parliament his Metropolitan Police Act, proposing a full-time, uniformed force for the entire city. His idea was simple but revolutionary. Instead of elderly watchmen guarding parishes, London would be patrolled by trained constables. Young, disciplined, sober men, answerable not to local councils but to the Home Office itself. There was outrage. Critics called it a standing army in blue. They saw in it the shadow of tyranny. England, they said, would never tolerate soldiers marching its streets in peacetime. Cartoonists mocked Peel, drawing him as a petty dictator surrounded by Peelus and Bobbies, terms meant as insults that would, ironically, become affectionate nicknames in time. Still, Peel pressed on. He argued that safety was not an act of punishment but of prevention. The purpose of police, he said, was not to enforce fear, but to preserve peace. And so, in September of that year, 200 new men took to the streets, wearing dark blue coats, stiff hats, and polished boots. London's first modern police officers had arrived. The fall of the watchmen, the old watchmen saw them as invaders. To men who had spent 30 years walking their rounds, the arrival of these tall, silent figures in matching uniforms felt almost insulting. Where once they had called the hours with cracked voices, the new constables moved without sound, their presence itself the signal of authority. In Westminster, several watch houses refused to close. Old Charlies continued to pace the streets beside the new police, calling the hours as they always had. Past 12 o'clock, and all's well. But now their voices were met with confusion, even laughter. Children followed them, shouting, "Look, there goes the old police." In one case, a watchman struck a young constable who had ordered him off his beat. The newspapers loved it. Old Charlie's last stand, they called it. Within a year, most of them were gone. The parishes that resisted longest were either absorbed into the new system or left to fade away. By 1835, the night watch of London was officially defunct. The new order, the Metropolitan Police, were unlike anything the city had ever seen. Each man was issued a uniform, a numbered badge, and a set of strict rules: no drinking on duty, no fraternizing with the public, no unnecessary conversation, and always maintain a calm demeanor. Their presence was meant to be reassuring, a visible symbol of peace, rather than of force. They patrolled in pairs, each assigned a beat, each responsible for every broken window, every lost child, every suspicious sound. Londoners at first were wary. Some jeered, some spat. But others, especially the shopkeepers and the poor, began to feel something new, a fragile sense of safety. The gas lights glowed brighter at night now. The cries of "Stop thief!" became rarer, and in the fog, where once a lone